In the last 24 hours, something happened that the financial world has been dreading for 3 years. A clock reached zero. Not a metaphorical clock, not a political talking point. A real, documented, time-stamped ultimatum posted by the President of the United States, directed at the Islamic Republic of Iran, warning them, in capital letters, that there will be nothing left of them if they do not move, and move fast. The post went up, the world read it, and Iran did nothing. Not because they are brave, not because they are reckless, but because of something far more dangerous than defiance. And that something is exactly what this video is about. This is Strategic Breakdown, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this now, because by the time most people understand what is happening here, the damage will already be done. So let us start with what the world actually saw. Trump posted on Truth Social a message that left no room for interpretation. The exact words, "For Iran, the clock is ticking, and they better get moving fast, or there won't be anything left of them. Time is of the essence." That is not diplomatic language. That is not a negotiating position wrapped in careful legal wording. That is a leader who has already made a decision in his mind and is giving the other side a final window to prove him wrong. And the other side, right now, cannot respond. That is the real story. That is the thing nobody is saying clearly enough. Because here's what most analysis gets wrong about this moment. Everyone is asking whether Iran is being defiant, whether Tehran is calling Trump's bluff, whether the mullahs are calculating that America won't strike twice in one administration. Those are the wrong questions. The right question is something more structural, more dangerous, and far harder to fix. And we are going to get there. But first, you need to understand the geography of what is actually at stake. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That is the width of a coastal highway. And through that 21-mile gap, somewhere between 17 and 20% of all the oil traded on Earth passes every single day. Not every month, every day. Roughly 18 to 21 million barrels of crude oil, liquefied natural gas, refined products, all of it funneled through a choke point so narrow that a single coordinated naval blockade, a mine-laying operation, or a cluster of precision drone strikes on key tanker corridors could functionally halt global energy supply within 72 hours. That is not an exaggeration. That is the documented assessment of the United States Naval Institute, the International Energy Agency, and independent defense analysts who have studied this scenario for decades. And this is where things get worse. Because the oil market does not wait for an actual blockade to happen. The oil market prices in the probability that it will happen. So when Trump posts that message, and Iran goes silent, and bond markets begin selling off the same morning, what you are watching is not panic. What you are watching is the market saying, the probability of a disruption just crossed a threshold that changes how we price everything. When bond markets sell and oil futures spike simultaneously, that is the financial system's nervous system firing. That is not noise, that is signal. Now let us go deeper, because here is the layer that changes this entire story. Iran is not ignoring Trump's warning because some general in Tehran sat down, reviewed the situation, and decided to hold firm. That is the cinematic version of this story. The reality is something far more alarming. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not a unified decision-making entity right now. It has not been for several years. What exists inside Iran at this moment is a fractured power structure, where the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guard, the elected presidency, the hardline clerical establishment, and the pragmatic negotiating factions are all pulling in different directions simultaneously. And none of them has the institutional authority to unilaterally say yes to a deal framework without triggering a political crisis inside the regime itself. Think about what that means in practical terms. Trump sets a deadline, a clock runs down, but on the other side of that clock, there is no single hand that can reach out and stop it. There is a committee of competing interests, each one afraid that agreeing to terms will look like surrender, each one calculating what the domestic cost of compromise will be, each one watching the others for signs of weakness. This is not strength. This is paralysis dressed up as defiance. And the critical difference between those two things is that defiance can negotiate. Paralysis cannot. Military analysts are already warning that this structural deadlock inside Iran may be the most dangerous factor in this entire crisis, because it creates a scenario where Trump, watching Iran not respond, concludes that they have made their choice, that they are not interested in a deal, that the silence is the answer. And that is where everything breaks down, because the silence is not a strategic answer from Tehran. The silence is the sound of a system that literally cannot respond fast enough for the timeline that has been set. Here is the technical picture you need to understand. A sanctions relief and nuclear compliance framework, which is the minimum foundation for any deal that would unlock Hormuz, requires, at bare minimum, the blessing of the Supreme Khamenei, coordination with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who have operational control over the Strait's mine-laying and missile capabilities, parliamentary signaling in Tehran, and some kind of back-channel confirmation to American negotiators that a framework is workable. Under normal circumstances, with normal diplomatic momentum, that process takes weeks. Under Trump's current public timeline, measured in days, that process is functionally impossible. And this is where things get really dark, because Trump knows this, his advisors know this, the intelligence community knows this, which means the question we should all be asking right now is not whether Iran will respond in time. The question is whether Trump's deadline was designed to be answered at all, or whether it was designed to justify what comes next. Intelligence reports suggest that strike packages targeting Iranian energy infrastructure have been updated and are at varying levels of readiness across U.S. Central Command assets in the region. That is not speculation. That is the standard operational posture for a military that has been watching this crisis escalate for months. Pre-planned targeting packages for Iranian oil refineries, the Karg Island export terminal, which handles roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, and key Revolutionary Guard naval facilities near Bandar Abbas have existed in updated form for years. The question has never been whether the U.S. can strike. The question has always been whether there is a political decision to do so. And right now, the political environment around that decision has shifted. Here is why. Trump's domestic political coalition is watching this moment closely. There is a significant faction of his base and his foreign policy inner circle that believes the failure of the Obama-era nuclear deal, the failure of the first-term maximum pressure campaign to produce a permanent settlement, and the ongoing Iranian support for Houthi attacks, Hezbollah rearming, and regional proxy warfare have exhausted the diplomatic track entirely. That faction is not arguing for war as a first choice. They are arguing that continued Iranian intransigence in the face of explicit American ultimatums makes a military response not just justifiable, but necessary for American credibility globally. And that argument is gaining ground inside the room where decisions get made. But here is what that faction is not fully accounting for. And this is the thing that keeps serious defense analysts awake at night. A strike on Iranian energy infrastructure does not end the crisis. It begins a different and potentially far worse one. Let us walk through the options, because every single one of them has a problem, and understanding why matters enormously right now. Option 1. Trump strikes limited military targets, naval assets, missile batteries, drone launch sites, and stops short of energy infrastructure. The goal is to demonstrate resolve, degrade Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz directly, and create pressure for rapid talks. The problem with this option is that Iran has pre-positioned its response to exactly this scenario. Revolutionary Guard commanders have publicly and privately indicated that any U.S. strike, regardless of scope, triggers automatic activation of Hormuz mining operations and missile salvos targeting Gulf state energy facilities. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have American bases on their soil. A U.S. strike that is intended to be limited immediately puts American allies at risk of Iranian retaliation that neither they nor Washington fully controls. The strike intended to de-escalate becomes the opening move of a broader regional war that nobody has a clean exit from. Option 2, a full strike campaign targeting Iranian nuclear sites, energy infrastructure, and military command nodes simultaneously, the so-called decapitation and degradation strategy. The stated goal would be to so thoroughly damage the regime's military and economic capacity that it cannot sustain a prolonged closure of Hormuz. The problem here is the oil price math. Energy analysts have modeled this scenario extensively. A simultaneous strike on Karg Island, Abadan refinery, and Bandar Abbas naval facilities, combined with Iranian retaliatory mining of Hormuz, would remove somewhere between 15 and 20% of global daily oil supply from the market in a window of days. The current baseline oil price, already elevated from regional tension, would move past $150 per barrel within the first 72 hours of such a scenario. Some models using realistic supply shock parameters put the 6-week price above $180. At that level, global inflation data, which central banks have spent 3 years fighting, reignites immediately. Mortgage rates in the United States spike. European energy bills, which were already a political crisis, return to emergency levels. Asian manufacturing economies that import virtually all of their oil face input cost shocks that push several into technical recessions simultaneously. The weapon America uses to end the Iranian threat also detonates a global economic crisis that undermines every Western government trying to hold a domestic political coalition together. Option 3. Do nothing. Let the deadline pass, issue no further ultimatum, allow Iran's non-response to be absorbed into a continued diplomatic standoff. The argument for this option is simple. The world avoids an oil price shock, American allies don't face retaliatory strikes, and back-channel negotiations can continue quietly. The problem with this option is credibility. Trump has now, publicly and explicitly, staked American credibility on Iran responding fast. If that deadline passes with no consequence, every adversary on Earth, from Pyongyang to Moscow to Beijing, recalibrates their assessment of how seriously to take American ultimatums. The credibility cost of backing down after explicit public ultimatums is not theoretical. It compounds. It affects every negotiation, every deterrence posture, every alliance commitment that depends on allies and adversaries believing America means what it says when it draws lines. Option 4. A financial and energy isolation surge. Not bombs, but the most severe sanction and shipping insurance cutoff regime ever deployed against a single country. The idea is to so thoroughly freeze Iran's ability to export oil, import goods, and access the international financial system that the regime's internal factions are forced by economic survival pressure to reach the negotiating table. The problem here is time. That strategy works over months and years, not days, and the current crisis is measured in hours and days. Additionally, China has been systematically building the infrastructure to purchase Iranian oil outside the dollar system, outside SWIFT, and outside Western insurance frameworks for years. A new sanctions surge hurts Iran's ability to sell to Western-aligned buyers. It does not stop the approximately 40% of Iranian oil that flows to Chinese buyers through shadow fleet tankers operating under non-Western flags. The financial pressure campaign that might have worked decisively in 2012 is less decisive in 2026 because the world has spent 15 years building around it. Option 5, a regional diplomatic surge. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Turkey collectively approach Iran with a de-escalation framework, backed by economic incentives that Tehran's pragmatic faction can use as cover for climbing down from the current standoff. The problem is that this has been tried repeatedly and fails against the same structural obstacle we identified earlier. Iran's regime cannot take yes for an answer when its internal factions are more afraid of each other than they are of external pressure. The Revolutionary Guard, in particular, has a deep institutional interest in maintaining the Hormuz threat as leverage. Any deal that removes that leverage shrinks the Guard's strategic relevance. And the Guard will not voluntarily disarm its most powerful negotiating chip because diplomats in Riyadh propose a framework over tea. So here is where we land. Every option has a serious cost. Every pathway has a structural obstruction. And the clock that Trump set is running in real time, measured not in strategic planning cycles, but in social media posts and market open prices. This changes everything because the normal diplomatic architecture that manages crises like this, the back channels, the quiet intermediaries, the carefully worded joint statements that give everyone a face-saving exit, all of that requires time. And the public, real-time, capital letters nature of how this crisis is being waged compresses time in ways that make the normal architecture nearly impossible to deploy. And this is where the global reaction becomes critically important to understand. Because what happened in bond markets on the morning of Trump's post was not an overreaction. It was the market doing exactly what it is designed to do: process publicly available information and price risk forward. When institutional bond investors sell, they are making a statement about their expectations for inflation, interest rates, and economic stability over the next 1 to 3 years. The simultaneous sell-off in bonds and the spike in oil futures is the market saying, we now assign a materially higher probability to an oil disruption event than we did yesterday. That probability does not have to be 50% to move markets sharply. At 10 or 15% probability of a Hormuz closure lasting more than 2 weeks, the expected value of oil price impact is sufficient to reprice a significant portion of global fixed income. And here is the chain reaction that most people watching this story are not thinking about yet, because it does not stop at oil prices. Higher oil prices feed immediately into global shipping costs. Global shipping costs feed into consumer goods inflation. Consumer goods inflation feeds into central bank rate decisions. Central bank rate decisions affect mortgage markets, corporate borrowing costs, government debt service costs, and at a moment when major Western governments are carrying historically elevated debt levels accumulated through the COVID spending era and subsequent defense buildups, higher borrowing costs are not an abstract economic variable. They are a political crisis. Every major democratic government in Europe and North America is operating with a fiscal margin of error that is narrower than it looks on paper. An oil price shock of the scale that a Hormuz closure would trigger does not just raise gas prices. It creates conditions where already strained government budgets face sudden increases in debt service simultaneously with politically mandatory energy subsidy spending, at exactly the moment when public tolerance for economic pain is at its lowest point in a generation. Defense experts understand that the economic dimension of this crisis is not secondary to the military dimension. It is equal to it, perhaps greater, because a military strike that ends in 2 weeks but triggers an 18-month global economic deterioration cycle may ultimately do more damage to the American-led international order than the threat it was designed to eliminate. The reality is that we are watching a scenario unfold where the most powerful military in human history is facing a problem that cannot be solved with military power alone. Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz derives from geography that cannot be bombed away. The strait will still be 21 miles wide after any strike. Iran will still have the ability to rebuild mine-laying capacity. Iranian proxy networks across the region will still have the ability to launch low-cost, high-disruption attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure. The structural conditions that give Iran its leverage are not target coordinates. They are facts of geography, demographics, and ideology that have existed for 50 years and will exist after any conceivable American military operation. What this means is that the solution to this crisis, if a solution exists, is fundamentally political. And political solutions require a counterpart that can negotiate. And right now, as we have established, Iran's internal fractures mean that counterpart is not clearly present. The regime that exists in Tehran today is not unified enough to make a deal, not weak enough to collapse under pressure, and not strong enough to control its own hardline factions. It sits in a zone of dangerous middle, capable of enough defiance to maintain the crisis, but not capable of enough coherent decision-making to end it. Military analysts are already warning that this is the most structurally difficult diplomatic environment involving Iran since the Islamic Revolution. Not because Iran is more powerful than before, but because the combination of Trump's real-time public pressure style, Iran's internal paralysis, and the global economic sensitivity to any energy disruption creates a triangle of constraints where each element makes the others harder to manage. And now consider what is happening at the edges of this crisis that amplifies every single variable we have just walked through. A drone struck a UAE power facility within the last 24 hours. That incident has not been formally attributed. UAE officials are assessing. American intelligence assets in the region are tracking the attribution question. But here is the critical point. It does not matter for market purposes whether that strike was Iranian-directed, Houthi-launched, or the action of a non-state actor operating with partial Iranian knowledge. What matters is that it happened at the exact moment when the Hormuz standoff is at its most acute. The signal it sends to every energy market trader, every shipping insurance underwriter, every Gulf state energy minister, is that the threat environment in the region has moved from theoretical to operational. The infrastructure that feeds global energy supply is not safe. It is not abstract. It is a physical system of pipes, turbines, terminals, and tankers, and it is currently within striking range of forces that have both the motivation and the demonstrated capability to hit it. The truth is that this is what a genuine systemic crisis looks like before it fully detonates. It does not look like a single catastrophic event on a single morning. It looks like a cascade of smaller signals: a social media post in capital letters, a bond market sell-off, a drone hitting a power facility, oil futures moving 2% in a session, shipping insurance premiums quietly doubling, each one individually explainable, each one individually manageable, but collectively describing a system that is approaching a threshold beyond which the normal tools of management stop working. We are at that threshold right now, not past it, but at it, and the next 48 to 72 hours will determine which side of that threshold the world ends up on. Because here is what has to happen for this to de-escalate. Iran's pragmatic faction, and it does exist, it is real, it operates through back channels that remain partially open, needs to find a way to signal to American negotiators that a preliminary framework is possible, without that signal being publicly visible in a way that lets the hardline faction or the Revolutionary Guard characterize it as capitulation. That is an extraordinarily delicate needle to thread under any circumstances. Under the current conditions, with Trump's message live on Truth Social, with oil markets moving, with a drone strike being assessed in the UAE, with bond markets signaling inflation fear, threading that needle in the next 72 hours borders on the diplomatically miraculous. And if that needle is not threaded, then we are looking at a scenario where Trump, concluding that Iran has made its choice, authorizes the strike packages that are already updated and ready. And then we are not analyzing a crisis anymore. We are analyzing the first hours of a conflict that has no defined endpoint, no agreed rules of engagement for de-escalation, and no clear mechanism for a ceasefire that both sides can accept without losing face internally. This changes everything, not in the way that phrase gets overused in media, but in the specific, structural, measurable way that means the frameworks we have used to manage Middle East energy security for 40 years are no longer adequate for the situation they face. The world built its energy architecture around the assumption that Hormuz, however tense, would remain functionally open. That assumption has underwritten trillions of dollars in infrastructure investment, trade agreements, military basing arrangements, and foreign policy commitments. If that assumption breaks, even partially, even temporarily, the recalibration required is not a policy adjustment. It is a redesign of how the global economy moves energy from where it is produced to where it is consumed. Some of that redesign has been underway for years: American LNG export infrastructure, European pipeline diversification, strategic petroleum reserve drawdown protocols. But none of it is complete, none of it is fast enough, and none of it was designed to handle a sudden, simultaneous shock combined with a global bond market under stress and an inflationary environment that has only recently been brought under partial control. So where does this leave us? It leaves us watching a clock that Trump set in public in capital letters, counting down in real time. It leaves us watching an Iranian government that cannot structurally respond fast enough, regardless of what any individual leader might want to do. It leaves us watching energy markets that are priced for bad news and bond markets that are pricing in the possibility of worse. It leaves us watching a drone strike in the UAE that no one has fully explained yet. And it leaves us with a set of options, every single one of which has a serious, potentially catastrophic flaw, and a decision-making environment where the margin for error is smaller than it has been in a very long time. The question is not whether this crisis will produce consequences. It already has. The bond market sold off, oil futures moved, shipping insurance premiums are being recalculated as you watch this. The question is whether the consequences stay in the range that the global system can absorb and adapt to, or whether the next decision, whichever human being makes it, in whatever room they make it, pushes this past the threshold into something that cannot be absorbed, cannot be adapted to, and cannot be undone. That is the question hanging over every trading desk, every government situation room, every tanker captain navigating the Gulf of Oman right now. And nobody, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Beijing or Riyadh or Brussels, has a clean answer to it. What do you think? Has Trump's deadline strategy already made a deal impossible? Or is this the pressure that finally forces Iran to choose? Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who still thinks this is just political noise. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of moment you want to be ahead of.